Good morning. Good morning. We welcome everyone to the People's Forum. This is our space is a movement incubator, a space where we encourage, build, and educate on the need for anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism in our times. We work with movements and people's organizations in the United States and all over the world to forward this agenda, a people's agenda for peace, justice, and dignity in our lifetimes. We're honored to convene this momentous meeting together with the Answer Coalition, because the time is now to say no to this war. The US empire, its friends and allies in NATO, have been manufacturing a consent. They think that with $91 billion, countless flags, warmongering, they can convince all of the planet to agree with their latest proxy war. But we say, no. Not only the people in this room are saying no, it's the mass sentiment of the majority of the people around the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Latin America, who also say no to this war. You don't have to be Ukrainian or Russian to call for peace. You have to be willing to be a human being. As people who collectively inhabit this planet, which we want to protect, not for ourselves, but for our children and our grandchildren and all those who inhabit it, we are saying no to NATO expansion. We're saying no to this proxy war. We're saying no to the US government's policy of bleeding Russia through the lives of countless Ukrainians. We are not going to wait for nuclear war. We are not going to wait for global famine. We are not going to wait for a further energy crisis. Why? Because we understand very clearly, we see very clearly that the only group of people who benefit from this war, the only people who benefit from there not being peace negotiations, continue to be the elites in Washington. We will not allow them to sacrifice either the Ukrainian or Russian peoples, or better yet, we will not allow them to sacrifice the planet for their new war of greed. And because this is a people's movement that we are inaugurating today, calling for peace, not for an abstract peace, because peace cannot happen in a vacuum. This is a concrete peace that we are calling for that allows both the Ukrainian and Russian peoples to live in peace and dignity without US foreign intervention imposing its agenda. For that, we need your support. For that, we need your help. For that, we need your participation if it is to be a people's movement. If you're in here in the audience, if you are watching online, know that if you want to support, you can text peace today to the number 44321. Express your support with a donation to help our cause. Because this is not a one-off event. This is only the beginning of a movement to fully challenge NATO and US imperialism. We are honored today to welcome an esteemed group of courageous political, and peace activists who have not been just in opposition to this war, but I would say have consistently been against U.S. wars and U.S. imperialism for their whole lives. We're honored to have with us here today Jill Stein, Brian Becker, Claudia de la Cruz, Vijay Prashad, and joining us online, we have the likes of Noam Chomsky, Jeremy Corbyn, and Medea Benjamin. Think of this meeting as a rally. So feel free to shout, feel free to raise your fist, feel free to support the speakers on stage. We want to start this morning, this exciting morning, in which we endeavor on a new phase of the anti-war movement by welcoming Claudia de la Cruz, who is the co-director of the People's Forum. Claudia is a longtime community organizer from the South Bronx. If anyone wants to question credentials, you don't question the South Bronx. Welcome, Claudia.
All right, y'all. Manolo gave me the green light. So money for schools and education, not for war and occupation. All right. Now that we all got this down packed. Money for schools and education.
Not for war and occupation.
Money for schools and education.
Not for war and occupation.
All right, we got to get them voices ready, because we at some point going to have to shout that out in the streets. You ready for that? All right. So when my comrades and friends organizing the conference called, they said, you got to talk about demonization. And I was like, word, I got you. And why did I say that? Because I think for us domestically, we could link and make the connections of what vilification and demonization look like. Like, just think about this. When Black young people are killed and murdered by racist cops, we're never trained to ask about the racist state. We're always trained to ask, what were they doing? Right? When a woman is violently raped and raped again in the courts of this patriarchal system, we're never taught to question patriarchy. We're never taught to ask, why does this person, this male-bodied person, feel that they could do this to this woman? We're taught to ask what? What was she wearing? That was the first thing, folks, right? Why was she out so late at night? Those are the things that we're taught. If it's a trans person, why they want to dress like a girl? Right? Those are the things that we're taught to ask. We have been trained to think in favor of the ruling class, their systems of oppression, and raise questions that put blame, dehumanize, and destroy the character of those who experience brutality, the brutality of patriarchy, the brutality of capitalism, the brutality of white supremacy and imperialism. And so when we think about demonization, we don't have to go too far. It happens every day in our US context. And so we should be able to make the connections with our comrades, friends, family, siblings across the seas. The tactic of vilifying the enemy and manufacturing public consent, like Manolo was talking about, to unleash violence and establish dominance has been utilized for centuries by the ruling class. They have used their systems and structures. And so through education or miseducation, the church, which happens to be very moral, more often than not, the corporate media, culture, Wakanda forever. We can talk about that later. Continuously tries to shape public opinion and move the masses towards justifying and supporting wars that impact our lives and the lives of the working class people globally. We're not taught to ask, why are these our enemies? In whose interest are they labeled as such? Who benefits from these attacks? Who is let off the hook? Who creates the conditions for such brutality? Those are not the questions that we're taught to ask. If we were to be critical and we were to understand that the ones who have always benefited are the global capitalist forces and US imperialism, they use our resources. They launch invasions, wars, while the majority of the world's population suffers the consequences. We put the bodies, we mourn the bodies. Mother Earth continues to suffer because they lie, because they justify, and because they train us to say, do what you must. Since 1980, the US has been in at least 15 overseas attacks, 15 overseas wars. Its military has bases in 85 countries. Who is the empire? When they're talking about Russia trying to reestablish their empire. For real, dude. Who is the empire? Who is the perpetrator of violence? The US controls the economy of countries and it suffocates those nations and states that want sovereignty and self-determination. And how do they do it? Through US sanctions. Who sanctions the US? Who calls them terrorists? Who brings them up to international courts? The US is the biggest perpetrator of war and brutality. So I gotta give a shout out to the haters, because that's what the Bronx do. TPF and the Answer Coalition called for this conference. Amazing, by the way. You all look very great. Give yourselves a round of applause. We're the courageous ones. And I would dare to say, I would dare to say that we made the right people upset. Shout out to the 5 people outside. We are clear. We must not be lukewarm in our positions. I will say that again. We must not be lukewarm in our positions. We don't have to be Russians, and we don't have to be Ukrainian to say that the US war machine needs to stop. We don't have to be Ukrainian. We don't have to be Russians. In the same way that you don't have to be part of the LGBTQ community to defend their rights. In the same way that you don't got to be black and brown to be anti-white supremacist. Those are not prerequisites to stand for justice. In fact, it is our responsibility to demand that the US stops instigating and escalating in this conflict. It is our responsibility to demand that the US stand down and instead of instigating and provoking and fueling war, takes the routes of negotiations. We have the responsibility to demand that the US stops the spread of NATO in that region. Actually, we have the right and responsibility to ask for the shutdown of that war machine. We have the responsibility to say, shut down NATO, shut down AFRICOM, and shut out every instrument of war that you have across the globe. Not on our name. We don't have to be anything else but conscious people committed to peace with justice, wanting humanity and the earth to be saved from catastrophe, hunger, and devastation, to demand that the US government stop its brutality against the rest of the world. And we need to be clear about that. So when people say, you aren't a Ukrainian, you ain't Russian, the answer is going to be, but I am goddamn human. The U.S. government administration and the Pentagon have historically created disastrous conditions and provoked conflicts all over the world. Nancy Pelosi. I would say God bless her heart, but that's not really how I feel. You remember, it just happened recently. The U.S. House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, goes to Taiwan. China's like, don't come. Do you go to anybody else's house, like, uninvited? Because if you do, you deserve to be reprimanded. China said, don't come. What does she do? She goes. And the rest of the G7 ministers are like, bet. And actually, China, you overreacting, bruh. You are overreacting. So you violate our space. You do not respect the lines. People talk about boundaries all the time these days. You don't respect the boundaries, and we overreact? That's the U.S. for you. The U.S. narrative about Ukraine, the Ukraine war, unprovoked attack by Putin. That's the narrative. But how much of that is a fact? Who is solidifying its empire at the expense of the people of the world if it's not the U.S.? We have a collective responsibility. And now I'm going to go into my can I do that? Theologian side? All right. We have a collective responsibility. I'm going to say that again because I like it. We have a collective responsibility, familia. Can I quote you, PJ? Yeah, for sure. All right. So I remember, it's the gospel according to VJ. Dismemberment. He talked about dismemberment. The dismemberment of our collective consciousness, the dismemberment of our bodies, the dismemberment of our history. We have a collective responsibility to remember. To remember. You like the mix, right? I mixed it up. We have a collective responsibility to remember. Let's remember how things really went down and how we got here. So I'll share some stuff. The U.S. pushed 4 waves of NATO expansion in that territory. In 1999, incorporating 3 Central European countries. In 2004, incorporating 7 more. In 2008, committing to enlarge the Ukraine and Georgia. And in 2022, inviting 4 Asia-Pacific leaders to NATO. And their aim was China. And their aim continues to be China. So let's not get it twisted. Those are facts. Let's remember that the U.S. fails to mention its role in the 2014 Ukraine coup. So you create the conditions to unleash chaos, and then you want to sell us the recipe to fix it? We have the collective responsibility to remember, to wake up from this collective amnesia that the ruling class enforces upon us viciously, spreading lies, fear, and hate. We have the collective responsibility to remember all the interventions in this American continent and whose hands were behind it. When we talk about the tactics of manufacturing consent, we got to talk about demonization, but that creation of the axis of evil, those external and eternal enemies, the terrorists, those are the words, those are the labels, then portraying themselves as the rightful keepers of the world order and democracy. They must put all of their resources to fight these evil people, evil nations, while depriving their people of what they need. Remember Panama? Remember Panama? Noriega. He was a CIA agent. He worked really closely with the CIA. He went to the School of the Americas. the school of assassins that developed a whole lot of the military dictators in the region. But he was good for the US. And then he wasn't. And then when he wasn't, Daddy Bush said, we gotta save Panama. That's what he said. And how did he think it was a good idea to save Panama? By launching a damn invasion. So once you're not useful to me and my interest, I'm gonna unleash the wrath of hell onto your people. And it's gonna be a collective punishment. And that's what happened in Panama. And what was the justification? He's a drug lord. He's a criminal. While at the same time financing dictatorships and the persecution of activists and organizers all throughout Central America. Let us remember that in El Salvador and Guatemala, there were hundreds of thousands of people who were murdered. And the US had its hands in it. The height of US hypocrisy. Remember Yugoslavia? I'm not going to say how old I am, but I remember. I remember. The forces collaborating with NATO and imperialism demonized Yugoslav leader Milosevic. NATO waged a 10-year war on Yugoslavia, wanting to regain hegemony. What did that mean for the people? Can you remember Kosovo? You remember that? It was 78 days of terror, of violence, of bombs dropping, of kids dying. Because they make it sound like, we had this shit happen and, brush it off, let's go to the weather type of news. People died from both sides. And the US had its hands in that. Their propaganda offensive obscured the interference, subversion, and divide and conquer tactics that were practiced by the US imperialists. And similar demonization campaigns have been launched against Gaddafi in Libya, Magube in Zimbabwe, Fidel Castro in Cuba. Long live the socialist revolution of Cuba. The same thing happened with Chavez and now Maduro, and long live the socialist project of the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela. Leaders of whichever country the US aims to crush and do not bend their knee to the empire are a threat. Not because they're materially a threat, but because ideologically they offer a new path. Whether we agree or not, that's besides the point. But the idea of the United States is to crush opposition, domestically and externally. And then what type of democracy are you talking about? So comrades, friends, family, we have a collective responsibility. Say with me, join me in this. We have a collective responsibility to remember. And we have a collective responsibility to not stand by passively. Let us not be stand-byers and watch these so-called leaders who don't lead shit and who don't represent anyone in this room or anyone in this country take us to hell time after time. Let us not stand by while they do this. They have showed us they are the ones who place more money into militarism and war than the basic needs of its citizens. Our struggle for peace, for justice, for liberation, self-determination is one. Our demands for the most basic human needs and rights are righteous. Are righteous. And they shouldn't only be our demands domestically. They should be our demands internationally because it is about human rights. How does any government commit over $10 billion to war in Ukraine when none of these people have done anything to me? during the worst recession since the 1980s? How do they commit to strengthening their military budget while there are 150 million people in the US living in poverty? How can they speak to justice when people can't afford to live in this country? How? Who is the actual threat to the US? People, working class people, who is the threat? And who is a threat for the rest of the world? Say it with me. We have a collective responsibility to remember and to build. To build an anti-war movement that is courageously and boldly anti-imperialist. It can't be a whitewash, let's have peace, we love everybody type shit. No. There are people who don't deserve to be loved. The U.S. and its war machine don't deserve no love from me. So we need to be clear about that. We must oppose this path of terror, of brutality, of violence, of imperialism, at home and abroad. Mother Earth and humanity is at stake. So what do we have? We have to remember and to build. Amen to that.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudia. We definitely have a collective responsibility to remember and to build and to act and to mobilize and to organize, because we will not allow those war criminals in Washington with their crocodile tears acting like they care about the Ukrainian people, when we know very well that they're actually willing to sacrifice every Ukrainian alive in order to accomplish their war against Russia. Let us not be confused. We now want to present, joining us online, a dear friend, a friend of the People's Forum, but I say a friend of all peace activists around the world, Medea Benjamin, co-founder of Code Pink, along with Jody Evans, and a longtime activist against US imperialism. We welcome Jody on screen. We welcome Medea on screen. I love Medea and Jody.
Be with you all today. I'm sorry I'm not there in person for this very important meeting. I'd like to talk about some issues of the US politics right now and how topsy-turvy everything is, how confusing it is, how hard it is to wrap our head around the political scene about Ukraine. For example, let's look at the fact that the most cautious people in the Biden administration right now are not the civilians, they are the military. The military, like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, who said that the Ukrainians have gotten about all they're going to be able to get. There's a stalemate. They should seize the moment and go to negotiations. Then there are the really hawkish members of the Biden administration, like President Biden himself, like the Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, who instead of talking about negotiations has been traveling around the world trying to gin up more weapons for Ukraine. They have not talked to their counterparts about trying to stop this war. And they seem to be pushing the illusion that the Ukrainians can get back every inch of territory that the Russians occupy, including all of Donbass and all of Crimea, and that they should fight to the last Ukrainian to get that. And then you have the political parties. On the one hand, you have the Democratic Party, where when the $40 billion was passed for Ukraine, not one Democrat stood up to question it. And you have another $37 billion that the administration has asked for and will probably be voted on very soon. And I think we can take bets that not one Democrat will stand up against that massive amount of money for Ukraine. We also have the issue of the Democrats, the 30 of them who signed on to this very, very modest letter saying, thank you so much, Biden, for all the help you have given Ukraine. And we in Congress have given all of this economic and military aid. And now we should pair that with negotiations. An extremely mild letter, only 30 Democrats signed on. And as soon as they did, all hell broke loose. And within 24 hours, they had either removed their names from the letter or the letter, after it had been signed, sealed, and delivered to President Biden, was then withdrawn. Quite a remarkable blowback against people who were merely calling for negotiations from the Democratic Party side. In the meantime, on the Republican side, while most of the Republicans are indeed the hawks they always are, like Mitch McConnell in the Senate calling for more and more weapons to Ukraine, there is an element of the Republican Party, mostly on the extreme right wing, who voted against the $40 billion, who complained about the US war in Ukraine and this never-ending, unwinnable war, and who said that they were feeling pressure from their base to vote against that enormous tranche of money. It's not only some of the more extreme members of the Congress, it's also people like Donald Trump, who have been going around in his rallies and on social media, and then when he announced that he was running for president, saying things like, this can end up in a nuclear war in which all of humanity will be annihilated. We've got to sit down on the table. I could be the negotiator. If I were in office, this war would never have happened because I would have talked to Putin. And it's important to understand that Donald Trump is a savvy politician, that he puts his finger up in the air, sees which way the wind is blowing, and then moves in that direction. So obviously, there is a lot of sentiment out there that this war is not in the national interests of the American people. You see the right wing and the Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson from Fox being the ones who are today the peacemakers, where the party of war is clearly the Democratic Party. Of course, let's not say that the Republicans are a peace party, but that certain elements of the Republican Party are understanding that this war cannot be won on the battleground. And so where does that put us today? I think it puts us right where we know we need to be, which is we don't have a movement that is strong enough to push both of the parties and to push the Biden administration into the right position. And that's why today's meeting is so important. That's why it's so important to gather up our forces and to extend them, to get the people in the environmental movement to recognize that this war has only led to the production of more dirty energy, giving a green light to the oil, the gas, the coal, the nuclear weapon war, the nuclear power producers, to say that we have to make up for the sanctioning of Russian energy and produce more dirty energy that US companies will benefit from. We have to get the environmental movement to work with us to say that this war and all wars are so destructive of the environment, and they have to stand with us for peace. We also are calling on the faith-based movement to say war is immoral, all wars are immoral, and they need to come with us and call for a Christmas truce like happened during World War I. So we are calling on faith-based leaders around this country to join the Pope, who has said we must get all sides to the table. And of course, people who are working for things like healthcare for all in the United States, a free college education, all of those people have to recognize that as we are going to spend over $100 billion in less than a year on this war, we must make people understand that that money could be going for needs at home, and of course could be going to address the climate challenge that really threatens our entire future as a planet. So I just want to end by saying thank you to the organizers. Thank you to those who are listening. We do have a coalition called peaceinukraine.org that you can join either as individuals or as organizations. Let's build this movement. Let's demand ceasefire and negotiations now. Thank you.
We are indeed building the movement. We are not stopping today. We are not stopping ever. For as long as NATO exists, for as long as US imperialism continues to threaten the planet, we will be in movement. We now want to welcome someone who, when I first joined the anti-war movement, was a big reference. He was one of the few anti-war intellectuals who could clearly define and denounce imperialism for what it was. A man who has often been ridiculed and attacked by the ruling elites, yet is loved by the masses of people around the world. And that is our dear friend and comrade, Noam Chomsky.
Let's start with a truism. A war can end in one of two ways. One way is that one side surrenders, the other sets the terms of surrender. Way, there's a negotiated settlement. That's one truism. Let's turn to a second truism. In a negotiated settlement, neither side achieves its maximal goals. Each side agrees to live with it as the best of existing alternatives. These observations seem simple enough, but they actually merit some thought. Let's take a look at US policy. Openly, repeatedly announced, no ambiguity. Continue the war in order to severely weaken Russia, so severely that it will not be able to undertake aggression again. Well, let's think what that means. Take it literally, which is, I presume, how Russia understands it. Literally, it means US policy is to impose conditions on defeated Russia, which are even harsher than those imposed on Germany at Versailles a century ago. Those weren't harsh enough. They didn't prevent German aggression. You can think what that means and how any Russian leaders would interpret it. US policy is adopted almost reflexively by the United Kingdom, and with various kinds of wavering by the NATO leadership generally. Well, all of this has consequences. One consequence is plainly bars negotiations. There is actually an official argument supporting this stance. It's that the war should go on until Ukraine is in a better bargaining position. Of course, there's an option left understood, unsaid, but understood, maybe in a worse bargaining position. Well, this stance, you don't say that, of course. This stance reflects nothing more than a commitment to continuing the war as long as it benefits the United States by weakening Russia severely and establishing the US more firmly as the world dominant power. Well, by now it's also openly recognized that continuing the war provides a valuable opportunity for the United States and its allies to test new equipment and advanced techniques of warfighting about which they're very proud. Also unsaid is that these plans are based on a ghastly gamble. So the hope that if Putin is defeated, he'll pack up his bags, quietly slink away to oblivion, maybe worse. The gamble that he won't resort to the conventional weapons that everyone agrees he has to devastate Ukraine, with consequences that are all too easy to imagine. It's conventional weapons. We should bear in mind that almost all the talk about nuclear weapons is in the West. Russia has occasionally enunciated the standard doctrine of nuclear powers. If its survival is threatened, might resort to nuclear weapons. The United States actually has a far more expansive doctrine. That's an important matter, but I'll put it aside here. Continuing with the facts, US and UK military analysts anticipated in advance of the invasion that Russia would find their kind of war. The US-British kind of war, style of their ally Israel against defenseless Gaza, is to go at once for the jugular, shock and awe, at once destroy communications, energy, water supplies, sewage treatment, transportation, anything that keeps a society functioning. Russia didn't do that, much to the surprise of US and British analysts. The ghastly gamble is that Russia won't descend to the US-UK style of war. That gamble is already beginning to fail. Putin has recently begun to imitate the warrior states of the West. His recent attacks on Kiev targets have been bitterly condemned, rightly so, condemned by people who had little or no objection when their side carried out the atrocities on a much greater scale, in fact. But let's put hypocrisy aside. The crucial matter is the ghastly gamble, the willingness to gamble that Russia will accept defeat passively and not react in the manner of the Western warrior states. That's the clear and explicit meaning of the official policy of continuing the war in order to severely weaken Russia. These are all virtual truisms. Let's look then at some facts. Russia's criminal invasion of Ukraine is taking a terrible toll. The longer it continues, the more severe the toll. Ukraine, of course, is the primary victim, but the impact reaches far beyond. It includes millions facing starvation in countries relying on grain and fertilizer from the region, and also fuel that's being diverted to Europe and the rich countries. It includes the whole world facing the possibility that a confrontation between the world's two huge nuclear powers will drift out of control, leading to terminal war. It's all too easy to sketch plausible scenarios. Actually, we just witnessed one of the many possibilities a couple of days ago when a Ukrainian anti-aircraft missile accidentally hit Polish territory. Next time, it could be a Russian missile attacking supply lines to Ukraine, as the Western warrior states would not hesitate to do in comparable circumstances. And just to be honest, comparable circumstances are unimaginable, because far short of that, they would have resorted to far more extreme violence. Well, another grim consequence of the perpetuation of the conflict is reversal of the limited efforts to deal with the most severe crisis that has ever arisen in human history, the destruction of the environment that sustains life. No need to elaborate on the severity of the threat. Anyone with eyes open understands that we have a narrow window in which we can carry out measures to avert an indescribable catastrophe. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has partially closed that narrow window. It has led to sharp increase in fossil fuel production, cut off from cheap Russian gas. It's now importing vast amounts of far more expensive, far more polluting liquefied natural gas from the chief producers of this lethal substance. US in the lead. They're pricing poorer countries out of the market with terrible impact. Sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline locks this destructive system into place. And interestingly, that sabotage is another topic we're not permitted to talk about in free societies because of what we'd immediately conclude. New investments are being made in fields that can be exploited for decades for fossil fuel production. Profits of the fossil fuel companies are exploding about as fast as those for weapons producers as new prospects open for destroying human life on Earth. The euphoria in executive offices is unconstrained as they propel us to the final precipice. The longer the war continues, the greater will be the toll, reaching perhaps to the end of organized human life. Speak of the vast number of species we are wantonly destroying. That, of course, is assuming that we can ward off the option of destroying ourselves more expeditiously with nuclear war. It's a possibility that is now being casually discussed as if it were an option. It's an indescribable descent to a state beyond insanity. Well, I'm sorry if these remarks seem hyperbolic. They're not. All of this tells us that every possible path to a diplomatic settlement should be pursued in accord with the wishes of almost the entire world, including the core of Europe, including, for example, 3/4 of the population of Germany. I won't run through the record. Prior to the invasion, there were opportunities for diplomatic settlement within the general framework of the Minsk agreements. As recently as last April, Ukraine-Russia negotiations were proceeding under Turkish auspices. The two Western warrior states, US and Britain, both registered opposition to them. Interest in diplomacy is so limited that there's almost no coverage. So we do not know how significant a factor this was in the collapse of the negotiations. As the conflict persists, positions harden, the options for diplomacy narrow, the ghastly gamble becomes even more ominous. There is no time for delay.
Thank you, Noam. Excellent message from Noam Chomsky. We cannot continue to wait as the threat of nuclear war looms over humanity. As we speak, US nuclear bombers stationed in Europe are somehow notices away from pulverizing their so-called Russian enemy. At the same time, as we speak, 345 million people around the planet face hunger. This number increased from 222 million just since March. In this ghastly gamble of what Noam Chomsky speaks about, who is it that the US ruling class is willing to sacrifice? They constantly talk about sacrifice. Biden says the American people are willing to sacrifice in order to support this war in Ukraine. The problem is, are we actually going to let him sacrifice the planet?
No.
Are we going to allow them to sacrifice the Ukrainian people?
No.
Are we going to allow them to sacrifice the people of Africa, Asia, and Latin America?
No.
We refuse in the name of peace. We refuse to accept their conditions and their terms. We are beyond honored. I am so excited to have Jill Stein in the house. Because Jill Stein is, I don't even know if I can call her a politician because I don't want to insult her name. But she has been someone who has, in multiple political spaces and debates in the political arena, has demonstrated a new type of politics, a different type of politics. In her time, she's been twice presidential candidate for the Green Party in the United States. And quite often, I would say she's used to it now. She is a lone voice for peace. She's often a lone voice for what is rational, for what is just. Jill Stein, we're honored to have you here. This is a pleasure.
I'm so honored to be here. I feel speechless from having heard my own thoughts. I don't know if you're all feeling this too, but it's like this is such a reality check here that's going on. It's really great to see that we are not crazy, you know. We really are telling the truth. We really are pointing the way forward. For those whose hair is my color, we've been through this many times. We've seen this certainly since Vietnam. We really cut our teeth on what it means to fight manufactured consent. It is not easy when you are facing wall-to-wall saturation propaganda 24/7. We know what that's about, but we also, and we went through this certainly in Iraq, big time, weapons of mass destruction that weren't there, Saddam Hussein's, horrific abuses, the yellow cake that also wasn't, all these myths, one after the other. So for those of us who've been through this many times, some of us at least have really learned to approach the prevailing propaganda with a lot of skepticism. You have to assume it's not true until proven otherwise, instead of just accepting being powerless, being hopeless, and entrusting our fearless political leaders and their security state to direct us forward. We've seen where that goes. And in many ways right now, we are sort of facing the logical conclusion of a political and economic system which is run whole hog for the benefit of the elites. It's no exaggeration to say that this is, whatever you want to call it, end stage capitalism, end stage empire, the colonialist, white supremacist, male supremacy project, whatever you want to call it, this is it. This is where it goes. This is unacceptable, unsustainable, unsurvivable. And the chickens have come home to roost here, back here in the seat of the empire. The chickens have really come home to roost in the struggles of the everyday American people, working people, and the poor, who are growing by the millions in the US and around the world. We see a few billionaires. We see the expansion of the billionaire class. They've added some, I don't know, hundreds to their ranks, while hundreds of millions have joined the ranks of poverty, severe and abysmal poverty. So, this system just doesn't last. And we are all in the crossfire. It's not just the people of Ukraine who are being set up to the last person, to the last man, woman, and child. Their lives are being expended. We are all a part of this vast exercise of unaccountable and abusive power on the part of economic and political elites. And we are saying no more. The buck stops. And it's just music to my ears to hear what everybody has been saying here. I want to, inject, what should I say, confidence and power into our position. As Alice Walker has said, excuse me, and others before her, the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. It's really amazing how much power we have, even on this issue. Thank you. Gallup, the polling organization, has been doing monthly polls where they ask people, what is the most critical issue? What is the most important issue to you? If you look at Congress, you'd think, well, obviously the most important issue is Ukraine. It is weapons sales and production. It is the military-industrial complex. That's what Democrats and Republicans agree on. That is their funding priority, not funds to expand the child tax credit, not funds for health care as a human right when 70,000 people every year are dying from lack of health insurance. And that's on top of the COVID deaths, where 1 out of every 3 were linked to a lack of health insurance. It's not the housing emergency that is just exploding before our very eyes. There's something like 11 million people right now who are facing potential imminent eviction, and that is certainly growing. Those figures are old because what is being hit by inflation, it's not only energy costs and food costs, it's also housing, big time. So we're not funding that. No, to look at Congress, what we have to fund, and this is very clear and very explicit, what we have to fund are a new generation of nuclear weapons, are more tanks for Ukraine. It's more armaments. That's their number one priority. But to look at this Gallup poll, what you see actually, excuse me, is that the issues that people rate as number one are economic issues. It's economic security, it's inflation, it's the cost of living, it's 60-some% of people who are living paycheck to paycheck. It's the growing economic desperation, which is at the top. And next to that, it is what should we say? It's the betrayal of our governing officials. That's actually like the number 2 official. That's the number 2 rank, is how outrageous we are being governed and how abusively we are being governed. That's the number 2 issue. So you don't hear about this, on MSNBC. You're not hearing about what's important to people. You're just hearing kind of the Defense Department talking points. That's what's important to them. But where does Ukraine and Russia rank Well, it's about 1% of people who say that this is the leading and key issue. So that should really tell us something. And those of us, who've been through this before, who watch how the military-industrial media complex really comes on, with all guns blazing, and we're supposed to be accepting their version of reality, which is just totally turned on its head, that begins to crack, and that fades right away. We can smell a rat from the very beginning. This has been a rat from the beginning, and this one is falling apart, I must say, much faster than the other propaganda efforts have really fallen apart. And as Noam Chomsky was saying, to actually look at real deep polling across the world or even in the EU, there is not support for this war. There's much greater support for actually negotiations and a peaceful settlement ASAP. So we should have, all the confidence and faith in our heartfelt intuitions. As Claudio was saying, above all, we are human beings here, and we are listening to our hearts, and we are listening to the hearts of our fellow humans, regardless of what side of any border they happen to live on. We know really what the story is. And the story is that all of us are in the crosshairs right now. We're all in the crosshairs. I want to expand on that just a little bit, because no doubt we are going to be having this conversation at our Thanksgiving dinners, and we're all not going to be on the same side if your family is out like mine. And we have a job to do. No pressure, but like Claudia was saying, we have a collective responsibility to remember and to tell the truth and to share truth and justice with the people we are in community with and in family with. And that is going to really, that will be the leading edge of the change, just like being out in the street will be the leading edge of change. Really using all of the tools at our disposal to throw the bums out from elected office. That will be part of the change that also needs to happen. But I want to talk a little bit about how this is hurting us. We at the center of the empire, who are supposed to be like all for this. I want to just say a few things about the many ways that this is hurting. And let's see, maybe we will try to show a picture or two. Let's see. This does not seem to be advancing. Okay, great. All right, so this one, you may be familiar with this. This is just the diagram of our budget, the congressional budget. And just, in a glance, picture tells 1,000 words here. You see the military budget. This was, I think, 1 or 2 years ago, where it was a mere $752 billion. It's now actually quite a bit more. It's about $740 billion, which is proposed for the coming fiscal year. So it's growing, 840. Did I say 7? It's 840. So it's actually growing by leaps and bounds. And this doesn't even tell the whole story, because lots of pieces are kind of buried where you won't see them, like nuclear weapons development. Where is that? That is in energy and the environment. Why? Because it's destroying the environment. Maybe that's why they're putting it there. I don't know. But there are tens of billions of dollars that are buried there. There's Homeland Security. There's the VA. Why do we have all these health issues to deal with for our veterans who've been put on the front lines, having very little choice in the matter? That too is a sequela of these wars. So it's actually $1 trillion a year. It's already $1 trillion a year. It's getting bigger, and it's more like 2/3 of the budget now. It's not a mere 50%. It's way more than that. And you can see, what does that leave? It just leaves a pittance for everything else. And this is just, again, the money behind the madness. This goes a long way to say why it is that all these crazy things are happening. They are being funded. Next slide. So you'll see on the bottom left, endless war is getting about $1 trillion a year. Social programs, if you add them all up, they're getting about half that amount. And any one department is just getting a tiny, a pittance. That is not okay. It's not okay that it's half as much as military funding. And then the climate collapse that we hear so much lip service to from the Democratic Party in particular. What is it actually doing about that climate crisis? Well, now it has completely gone into reverse gear on the climate crisis because of the war. As previous speakers alluded to, that is one of the biggest victims of the war, is that it provides a perfect excuse not only for war profiteering, but also for fossil fuel profiteering. And it becomes an opportunity not only to use more fuel, because, right, we have to drop a lot of bombs and fly a lot of airplanes and do all that stuff, but also we have to build new fossil fuel depots, and we have the sanctions really to thank for this. Most of the disruption of energy supplies around the world is not due to the war, it's mostly due to US sanctions. So we don't even have to wait to stop the war. We could just end the sanctions right now, and then guess what? Most of the hunger crisis and most of the fuel crisis goes away like that. We have the power to do that. We don't have to wait. We don't have to wait. And the 350-some million people now who are facing food insecurity, 50 million of them who are facing acute starvation. That doesn't have to be the case. With the flick of a pen, the food and the fuel could begin to flow again, even before we've gone through the difficult process of negotiating a settlement. We could have a ceasefire also with the flick of a pen. So this is a war of choice. This is a catastrophe of choice. And it's not just Putin's invasion. Putin's invasion was the latest response to a buildup and an escalation of mutual attacks that have been going on at least since 2014, with the US support for the coup in the Maidan, where the right wing and Nazis had a very major role to play because they put their hands around the throat of everybody involved, and they don't take no for an answer. You may remember that Zelensky, who now seems really kind of over the edge, he was elected on a peace platform. He was elected to implement the peace accords, the Minsk peace accords. So that's where we should be. That is within our reach, and that is what we should be pushing for even right now. Let me just see if I can show another one here. The crisis of the war and the climate is not separate from the crisis of justice. And I just want to not leave that out here. And this chart, I want to just take a minute to explain it because it says so much about what's going on. And what you see here going from left to right is wealth, total wealth in the US. So it's going from 1989 up to almost 2020. You see wealth is growing. But where is it growing? It's growing in that blue section, which is the top 10%, and the piece above the little red line is the top 1%. So it's mainly the top 1% that is making out like bandits here. What's happening to the lower 50%? Well, the lower 50% is the brown line at the very bottom, if you can even see it. That is 2% of our wealth is distributed among the entire half of the population, which is making do with this. This, in my mind, goes a long way to explain why we are in the mess we are in. Not only because everyday people are really being starved to death, literally, but also because power is concentrated, increasingly concentrated into the hands of a very few who purchase their politicians as usual, and between the economic and political elites, they keep generating policy to just make this worse. So that's just to include in our discussion, that we have a crisis of war, we have a crisis of climate, and we have a crisis of justice. We don't solve any of them without solving all of them. And then I will try to wrap up because I could keep going all day here. It's really wonderful to have you all here doing what you're doing. I want all of us to help all of us lead the charge on this because, again, no pressure, but it really is up to us. We're here because we get it, and as has been said here several times today, the clock is ticking and we don't have much time, so we really need to use every means at our disposal. Part of that is being out in the street. Part of that is also just in our conversations, talking to our friends and neighbors in our communities. So what is the cost of militarism? It's not only those dollars that we've been talking about, it's also that when you superpower the military, it does really crazy things. Our military is completely off the charts. It's those 800 bases that we have around the world, when the rest of the world has 30 of those bases all put together. It's the costs of our budget. It is 68 coups and regime change operations that have been instigated by the US since the Second World War. According to the Congressional Research Service, we have intervened with our military 251 times in the past 20 years. 20 years, 30 years, in the past 30 years. So you get a military that's doing crazy things, and we have the commitment to nuclear weapons. And in this recent nuclear posture review, in spite of Joe Biden's promises during the campaign that he was going to adopt a policy of no first use, he basically adopted a policy as, well, yes, we can use nuclear weapons on a first basis when we decide. We're not going to take any of our tools off the table. And that policy is one of complete nuclear madness. I also want to mention full spectrum dominance. Does that ring a bell to anybody? Yeah, okay. So people in this room probably know what it is, but just very briefly, full spectrum dominance is the established official policy of the US foreign policy and military establishment, which is, to put it very simply, it's that we will dominate all spaces and all other countries. And no, we will not allow competitors to emerge militarily or economically. So this goes a long way to explain why we've had this gearing up of hostilities towards both Russia and to China. They are not allowed. You are not allowed to become a full player on your own terms. That's basically what's going on there. And this policy, it turns out, was actually declared. How far back does it go? It actually goes back to the breakup of the Soviet Union, 1991. In 1992, the Pentagon issued its formal policy, basically that it will not tolerate the emergence of new competitors in the region of the former Soviet Union or anywhere else. It will not tolerate competitors that are hostile, and it also won't tolerate competitors among our allies. It actually said that. I mean, it's really incredible. If this was a person, you would be sending them to a social worker. I wish they had such a thing, The UN needs social workers. And as part of that exercise in full spectrum dominance, we have been basically undermining peace developments for a long, long time, for decades actually, but particularly in the conflict with Ukraine. And then the escalation towards the nuclear war. We have been the ones who have disrupted the treaties. The US of A is the one who essentially pulled out of and destroyed virtually every nuclear treaty. This is a big problem because when you have a lot of nuclear weapons and you don't have rules for how they're being used, it's very easy for people to panic when they think a nuclear weapon is approaching and to just, trigger the response when it's not even warranted. But in truth, the real solution here is just get rid of the nuclear weapons, all of them. And that really goes hand in hand with getting rid of our empire and our incredibly hyper-aggressive military state. It's not just the war in Ukraine, it's the whole reliance on militarism as essentially the basis of our foreign policy. That has to end. And again, the bottom line is that this comes back to us to roost. The chickens come home here to roost. And what's happening in the climate is another case in point. That just shows you how the temperature's been going up from the year, whatever it is, around 2000 up to current. So I won't say a lot more about that, except that the last 8 years on record have been the hottest years around. I'm only showing the Colorado River here because most of us are eating the food that is produced thanks to the Colorado River, which supplies half of the fruits and vegetables for the entire United States. It is 75% depleted. It is well on its way to a critical threshold where the water will not flow. So expect famine to be coming to a neighborhood near you pretty soon. This isn't something we can just sit back and allow it to go on. Same thing with the collapse of the ice sheets, which is well underway. This year, for the first time ever, rain was observed falling on Greenland and also on the South Pole, on Antarctica. And who knows what happens to ice when water falls on ice. It greatly accelerates the melting. So I wouldn't put great stock excuse me, in any assurance that, oh, don't worry, you know, massive sea level rise is a long way off. I mean, it's already well underway, and there are many countries who are paying the price in many forms. In Bangladesh, we've seen 33 million people have to get up and find a new place to live and a new source of food. 33 million, that's a third of the country. I mean, it's absolutely staggering. That's not from sea level rise, but that's just change in weather patterns and rain. So the climate has come home to roost, and I will mention 60% of animals, including mammals and reptiles, fish, and birds, are gone. 60% just since 1970. So it's really hard, I find, to put your hands around both what's happening with the war machine and what's happening with the climate. It's like my blood pressure goes through the roof to think about any one of these, and then to think about both of them. It's just, you know, it's just untenable. And it's really important to take that outrage that you get when you think about what the elites are doing to Mother Earth and humanity. It's really important that we target that into fighting, because this is a fight we can win. And as Alice Walker said, the biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with. We have it. In fact, we are not just like, you know, competitive. Peace is not just a good idea. It's actually the only way forward. So I'm gonna force myself to stop. One last thing, just I want to show this picture because this so demonstrates the connection between war and climate. Fossil fuels are the, they are the engine of war. So fossil fuel use goes way up. The military-industrial complex is equivalent to like the 47th nation in the rank of fossil fuel emissions. So it's substantial. It's not the whole 9 yards, but it is. Excuse me. Thank you. It is a very important part of the puzzle here. It's not only the fossil fuels, it's also the destruction of habitats, toxic pollution, the diversion of resources from other critical needs. There are just so many ways that these things interact. Here you just see the graphic from from a project at the Boston University on the interaction of climate and war, making the point that the military has been emitting basically 257 million cars worth of emissions. So that's a lot of stuff. It goes up, and here's one happening right now, or that just happened. This is the single biggest release of fossil fuels ever on record. That is the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines, which bubbled up as methane. You may know that methane is 80 times more powerful than CO2 in terms of its climate warming impacts. So this is just routine. I mean, this is what happens in war, and who could have done this? I don't know. Who possibly could have benefited from this? Well, what's the outcome? They're building 10 new LNG terminals, liquefied natural gas terminals, in order to replace what just got blown up mysteriously by someone we can't figure out who. But we are now building the replacement. 10 of these very destructive, very environmentally destructive terminals in the US and 10 terminals in the EU. And what does that mean? It's not only that more fossil fuels are being used, but it also means that a whole lot of new infrastructure is being built. So war is an end run around the limits and the climate cautions and things like that for the fossil fuel industry. War is a profiteering opportunity for both the fossil fuel and the weapons industry, and we're going to stop it. So with that, I just want to thank you all so much for being here and for carrying this incredible, glorious fight forward. We are going to win, and it's wonderful to be on your team. Thank you.
What's it gonna take to stop these war crimes? People power. When I say people, you say?
Power.
People?
Power.
People?
Power.
People?
Power.
People?
Power.
People power is the only thing capable of stopping these war crimes. And we're gonna need an expression of that people power right now. I see some folks with red buckets out here. This is not a church service, so we won't close the doors. But we're asking, if you agree with everything that's been said so far, if you agree that we have a collective responsibility, express by donating, whether it's $10, whether it's $20. If you want to donate $1,000, do it for the cause. Do it so that we can fight together. Do it so we can act. Let's get those red buckets going. Please open your hearts, open your wallets, so that we can collect and mobilize for the actions that are to come. Your efforts are important. And if you're watching online, don't think we won't pass the red bucket to you. For you, it's even easier. All you have to do is text peace today. P-E-A-C-E, today. We want peace today. You can text that to the number 44321. With your donations, we're going to go beyond today. We're going to go beyond tomorrow. Your donations mean we can actually be fighting on the streets for what we know is right. No one else is going to do it for us. We have to do it. That's why we're counting on each and everyone's donations. And if the buckets do come looking kind of half empty, we might have to do a church thing and close the doors. But luckily, to keep us informed and motivated, I actually want to call on a lead organizer of today's event. Someone who I would say has been not just a courageous voice, but a courageous organizer. Going back decades, Brian Becker has mobilized the anti-war movement in the United States. For those in my generation, Brian Becker's name is synonymous with the mobilizations of millions in the United States against imperialist war. That's why we are beyond honored to have him not just speak, but to welcome him to be a teacher today, to give us context, to give us history, to give us insight, not just into why this war is wrong, but ultimately why and how we will act against it. Welcome, Brian Becker.
Thank you, Manolo. And thank you to all of the other speakers. And we have two great speakers following me coming up, Eugene Puryear and Vijay Prashad. And I know Eugene is just back from the South, where a new union of Southern service workers and other low-paid workers was formed this weekend to take the fight against the billionaires. I also want to thank those who have come a longer distance. We have friends and comrades from Boston, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia. There's many other cities who are here. They're here to be part of the demonstration. I called it a demonstration. Well, it is a demonstration. To be part of this meeting and also to secure this meeting. You notice that we have people with security vests outside. Because guess what? When we announced that there was going to be a meeting with a very, when we were going to have a meeting with a very mild title, The Path to Peace in Ukraine. It wasn't like death to U.S. imperialism. It wasn't turn your guns around and turn the imperialist war into a revolutionary war. There were none of those kind of radical slogans. We had a slogan that said, the path to peace, negotiate, don't escalate. And as soon as we said that, all of the war makers, including the Zelensky government apparently, and the right wing of the Democrats and the Republicans, and of course, the capitalist media, which is, you can't get more warlike than the mainstream media, liberal and conservative alike, they all started attacking this meeting as if some terrible event was going to take place in Midtown Manhattan because we called for peace in Ukraine. You don't have to have a very radical slogan to draw the wrath of the war makers, because in fact, whenever people have organized and fought for and mobilized for peace, they do draw the wrath of the war makers. And it doesn't matter whether their slogans are soft and mild, whether they talk about negotiations or overturning capitalism. Just mobilizing the people against war is a great danger to the war makers, because if the people finally say no to war, the wars end. The ruling class can't do the wars without the people. I mean, just remember when Eugene Debs opposed the U.S. entrance into World War I in 1917, he made a speech against the war. He said, let's not go and kill other workers in other countries. He said, the only war I'll be in is a class war against the bosses. Again, that was a little bit more of a radical slogan. But because he was against the U.S. entrance in World War I, he was put on trial, he was convicted, and at age 66, he was sent to prison for 10 years at hard labor. And when he was in his jail cell, he ran for president and got 1 million votes from people who stood with him. This coming year will mark another anniversary, not only of Martin Luther King's birth, but his death. April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King assassinated in Memphis while standing with sanitation workers. His assassination came 1 year to the day that he stood at a podium in Riverside Church on April 4th, 1967, and he said, "The government of the United States, my government, is the greatest purveyor of violence on the planet, and we have to stand with the Vietnamese people and demand that they have a right to self-determination." And 1 year later, he was shot dead because the war makers don't want the people to talk about peace. And for Dr. King to courageously come out against the war in Vietnam meant that he would have been the leader of a new anti-war movement in the United States, drawing together the black community and the Puerto Rican and Latino community and the millions of whites who were already protesting against the Vietnam War. It would have been a rainbow, multiracial, multinational coalition for peace. And that's why Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated 1 year to the day after he announced his opposition to Vietnam. And then the year later, a young man, 21 years old, one of the great leaders of all time in the U.S. social justice movement, the chairman of the Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton, who is known as a leader of the Black Panther Party. Fred Hampton was also the leader of a multiracial, multinational peace movement against the war in Vietnam and in solidarity with the Vietnamese people and their right to determine their own destiny. And he was shot dead by the Chicago police and the FBI, December 4th, 1969. So when we see that our meeting under this very mild slogan, the path to peace in Ukraine, elicits all of this hostility and opposition, remember, it's not simply because Russia was the one that invaded on February 24th, 2022. The U.S. war makers will always oppose those who are advocating for peace, whether it's in Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan or Libya or Panama. It doesn't matter. If you stand for peace and against the war makers, you represent an existential threat. An existential threat, because if we win the people over, the war makers can't have the war. It's that simple. They don't fight their own wars. They get the working class to fight. They get the poor to fight. If the billionaires and the 1%, the bourgeoisie, had to actually fight imperialist wars, the wars would end. They would have ended a long time ago. They're only content with endless war and full spectrum dominance if we agree to send our children to fight and die under the slogans that the imperialists provide us. And every time they go to war, they always give it a noble cause. It's not the 19th century or even the early part of the 20th century where the U.S. could invade Haiti and march the Marines into Port-au-Prince and take all of the money back to New York City banks and do it just because they could. Nowadays, with modern sensibilities, they have to give the invasions a noble cause, not theft and plunder and pillage. It's for something good. In the case of Iraq, it was to save us from weapons of mass destruction. In the case of the bombing of Libya, it was to help protect civilians. In the case of the bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999, it was to help Muslims in Kosovo, as if American imperialism suddenly started to love Muslims. And now the endless war in Ukraine, which is what they want, it's to stop Russia and to save Ukrainians. And the war makers love Ukrainians suddenly. We're taught to love Ukrainians and care about them. And why? Because if U.S. imperialism had to send U.S. kids to go and fight Russians, there would be a movement of hundreds of thousands or millions of Americans against this war with Russia. But if the U.S. can have Ukrainians do all the dying, have them do all the bleeding, have all the suffering somewhere else, then we can continue, as George W. Bush said, to keep shopping, not think about it, not be worried about it, not to be too angry about it, and simply accept the demonizing, colorful, demonizing rhetoric against the enemy, in this case, Russia and Vladimir Putin. We have to stand up to the war because, as Noam Chomsky put it, I can't believe Noam Chomsky is not reading from a script. He's just that wise, that articulate, even as an elder who has been there for so many decades. He can say, this is a ghastly gambit. And it is. And you know, you think about who's engaging in the ghastly gambit. People like Anthony Blinken, who've spent their entire lives going to private schools, whose father was a Cold Warrior. People who are so privileged, so rich, who have never suffered at all. For them, all of this is just a big geostrategic chessboard where other people are the pawns and other people are dying, and they don't give a damn. They truly don't give a damn. In October 2021, Anthony Blinken, Jake Sullivan, Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Joe Biden, they must have woken him up for the meeting. They had a strategic session, and Biden was told that the Russians were preparing to invade Ukraine. And Biden said, really? I'm serious. This is a Washington Post account of the meeting based on people who were in it. So really? And they were like, yeah. And he turned to William Burns, who was CIA director, and he said, are they going to really invade? Yeah, they're going to do it. I think they're serious. Jake Sullivan, yeah, they're going to do it. And then publicly, they started to announce that the Russians were going to invade. Remember? I mean, on our podcast, we thought, no, the Russians aren't going to invade. I thought, no, that's just more imperial war propaganda. And the Russians said, no, they're not going to invade. But Anthony Blinken kept saying, yeah, they're going to invade. They're definitely going to invade. And during that entire time where the U.S. was predicting the invasion of Russia, how did the U.S. react to what they said was the coming invasion? They continued to insist that all of Russia's demands to not have Ukraine become a staging ground for advanced U.S. nuclear and conventional missiles that could reach their target in 5 minutes, meaning missiles that Russia could not defend against. When Russia said, you will not be allowed to bring your missiles to our border because we will never have a day of peace from now on, Blinken said those demands are non-starters. So they predicting the invasion of Russia. Russia says, look, we're really serious. This is a red line. We're amassing troops. You better negotiate. And instead of negotiating, Blinken and the Biden administration said, you don't tell us who can join NATO. And you don't tell Ukraine whether they can be in NATO or not. You, Russia, have no right to do this. And so for months. Not only did they do that, they pumped in another $10 billion of weapons at the same time. So Putin is being told, we're never going to negotiate. We are going to put the advanced weapons on your border. We know you can't defend against them. And basically, F you. Right? That was the message. Why? If they knew the invasion was coming, and they knew it would be horrible and thousands of people would die, why didn't they say to the Russians, okay, let's meet. Let's seriously meet. Let's talk about this. Maybe Ukraine could be neutral. Maybe it doesn't need advanced weapons that have a flight time of 5 minutes pointing at Moscow on your border. Maybe we can meet you halfway. Now, would that have been a reasonable position? Would that have been reasonable? I mean, think about when the Soviet Union / Russia put missiles in Cuba in 1962. The United States said to Cuba and to Russia, we are going to have a thermonuclear war unless you take those missiles out of Cuba. They were 90 miles away from the United States. I was a young kid. We all anticipated that there would be a thermonuclear war because we thought the Pentagon's going to definitely do it and the Russians aren't going to back down. But the Russians did back down. The Soviets did back down. Thankfully, the Soviets backed down, because if they hadn't, we wouldn't be meeting here today. There would have been a thermonuclear war. And the madmen, the lunatics in the Pentagon were prepared to do that. But now they're doing the same thing to Russia. And Russia says, look, we have red lines. Don't cross these red lines. We mean it. This is serious. And they did it anyway. They said no. Again, why? Because they wanted this war. Blinken wanted the war. Biden was informed that he wanted the war. And then he said, attaboy. They wanted the war because the war accomplishes some really important political, military, and economic objectives for U.S. imperialism. What are they? Number one, Europe was becoming independent of U.S. imperialism, and Germany and France and Italy actually want better relations with Russia, which means that they end their dependency on the U.S., which began at the end of World War II, when all of those countries lay in ruins because of the magnitude of violence in World War II. The New World Order that the U.S. created in 1945 said to Italy, Germany, and Japan, the defeated enemies of the U.S., you're now our friends. You can come in. We're not going to treat you as Germany was treated at the end of World War I, with heavy sanctions and Versailles. We're going to bring you into the world economy. We're going to give you access to the world market. We're going to let you, the German, Japanese, and Italian bourgeoisie, get rich again. We're not going to humble you and defeat you. But in exchange, you're going to be the junior partners of our government in its war against revolutions in Asia, and its war against socialism in Africa, and socialism in the Middle East, and socialism in Asia too. You will be junior partners, and you will be under our leadership, our domination. That was the unipolar world that the U.S. anticipated at the end of World War II. The U.S. created the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, and at Bretton Woods made the dollar the world reserve currency, a great privilege. All the other countries had to buy dollars. The U.S. could just print them. So the U.S. was creating a unipolar world, and all of Europe was fastened, as was Japan, under the domination of the U.S. hegemon. What the U.S. didn't expect in 1945 was that the Soviet Union would no longer be the sole socialist country, because revolution spread to China and Korea and Vietnam and Indonesia and India and the Middle East. That this revolutionary wave led to the creation of new socialist governments, and that the Red Army, which had liberated Europe from Nazism in Eastern and Central Europe, also facilitated the creation of new socialist states in that part of the world. So suddenly, the U.S. plans for a unipolar world were trashed because what emerged was a bipolar world, two camps, the socialist camp led by communist parties and the capitalist camp led by U.S. capitalism, saw each other as rivals, challenged each other for support and attention in other parts of the world. What we now call the Cold War, which was really a global class war between the workers and poor peasants, led by communists against capitalists everywhere. So the world divided in this bipolar fashion until the Soviet Union was overthrown and the socialist governments were vanquished in Eastern and Central Europe. And then the U.S. said, now we can do what we wanted to do in 1945. Now we can actually have a unipolar world. Now we can say to the rest of the world, we will not allow to emerge any rival, even a regional rival, like Iraq or Syria or Libya or Iran or Venezuela or Cuba. We won't allow any of them to exist. We are the global hegemon. This is at last the attainment of a unipolar world. And over the last 30 years, everything that we've seen in terms of U.S. policy has been designed to maintain, reinforce, and enforce that unipolar domination. But guess what happened? The U.S. went to war in Iraq because it was the unipolar power. And the Iraqis said, we don't give a damn what kind of power you think. We're not going to allow foreign troops to occupy our country without fighting you, resisting, and ultimately driving you from our country. And the Iraqi resistance bogged U.S. imperialism down. The same thing happened all over the place. The U.S. couldn't actually maintain unipolar power like as if it was the 19th century because the people of Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America won't go back. They're not going back to the 19th century. They're going to fight. They're going to resist. And they're going to win. So while the U.S. is bogged down trying to recolonize the so-called third world, China grew strong. Russia got back on its feet. As a major power, both of them, big countries, big populations, lots of natural resources, well-educated populations, big militaries, energy and oil supplies. Suddenly, even though China and Russia did not want to be the rival of U.S. imperialism, China kept saying, no, let's have win-win. We'll grow and you can still rule the rest of the world, just not us. That was China's kind of appeasement policy for 15 years. Libya, fine, we're going to abstain, but don't make it about us. Russia also wanted to be friends with American imperialism. Putin was even invited as a dinner guest to the G8 meetings, as long as they basically allowed the U.S. to be the unchallenged hegemon in the world. But then the U.S. can't stop itself. The organic trend towards counter-revolution and the decision to smash or weaken Russia and China because they were major powers and they were independent powers and they weren't going to be subjugated as colonies by the U.S., the U.S. decided, okay, we're going to go to war. And so U.S. has refashioned its military strategy. It's called major power conflict. And it became the priority of the Pentagon in its 2018 quadrennial report. And so Russia and China are thinking like, okay, the most powerful military in the world, the U.S., is preparing to go to war against us. What should we do? If you're Russia, what should you do? You know, the U.S. is now reorienting contingency planning, budgeting, ripping up arms treaties to get ready for the coming war with our country. You're Russia. And now you see that they're going to take Ukraine, which was the second biggest republic in the Soviet Union, historically, culturally, linguistically tied to Russia. They're going to incorporate Ukraine into NATO after a Nazi-led, U.S.-backed Nazi-led coup. And what are you going to do if you're Russia? Are you going to say, okay, fine? No. It wouldn't matter if it was Putin or any other political leader. It's untenable for the Russians to allow this to happen. This is what the U.S. plan was. The Russians knew it. Unfortunately, the Russians invaded Ukraine. Are we for that? We didn't think that was great. We thought that only unites the imperialists under the U.S. All of the opposition in Europe got muffled. It snuffed out the left-leaning and left-moving contradictions within Europe and put Europe really into a vassal state under the domination of U.S. imperialism. Lenin, Stalin, Brezhnev, didn't matter who the Soviet leader was. If you look at Soviet foreign policy, that policy was always designed to not allow the imperialists to unite at once against the Soviet Union because they would be too strong. By the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the Russian government allowed all of the imperialists to be united as one under the leadership of the U.S. So we have this terrible tragedy. Europe is more connected to U.S. imperialist domination. Thousands of Ukrainians and Russians are dying. The Ukrainian and Russian people were one people when they were the Soviet Union. You don't have to go to the 10th century, as Putin does in his speeches about the historical unity of Ukrainians and Russians. The Soviet Union existed from 1922 to 1991, and there was never a war between Ukrainians and Russians. They fought together and defeated fascism and imperialism. I mean, this is a terrible, terrible tragedy. But for us in the United States, in the belly of the beast, living in U.S. under the leadership of U.S. imperialism, a government that says it speaks for us, do we then sit back and say, oh, the Russians pulled the trigger on February 22nd, 24th, 2022. The Russians are the aggressors, and ignore all of this other history? Ignore what actually has been happening? Ignore the fact that U.S. imperialism wanted the war, obviously, as we could see, because they refused to negotiate in good faith when Russia said, this is it. They refused to because they wanted the war. And we have to say, as people living in the United States, that our enemies are really not in Moscow. They're not in Kiev. They're not in any other place. They're on Wall Street. They're in Washington. They're at Langley Air Base. They're at the Pentagon. So we want the war to end. We've picked a mild slogan: the path to peace in Ukraine. Our point in all of this is that the path to peace is really quite simple once you know what the path to war was. The path to war was the refusal by the Biden administration to negotiate over completely legitimate national security concerns of the Russian government. The real thing the U.S. could have easily done that would have saved Ukrainian lives was to say, yeah, Ukraine's not going to be part of NATO. Ukraine's not going to be a staging ground for advanced missiles that target Russia. The simple thing that they could have done to save Ukrainians, they didn't do because they didn't give a damn about Ukrainians. So the path to peace isn't really through Moscow or Kiev. The path to peace is through Washington, because it's their policies that made this war almost inevitable. Because I got carried away, I forgot one thing that I wanted to do early in the speech, but I want to do it. I want to use a video clip. It's about 3 minutes long. Victoria Nuland, some of you will undoubtedly know about this. Victoria Nuland, who was at this time in 2014 Assistant Secretary of State, had been Hillary Clinton's press spokesperson at the State Department when she became Secretary of State. She's a real neocon. Her whole family's neocon. She was in Ukraine in 2014 when the protests were going against Yanukovych. Who is Yanukovych? Was he corrupt? Undoubtedly. Was he elected? Yes. Was he anti-EU? No. He wanted to have good relations with Russia and with the West. He wanted to be neutral. And he said the Ukraine would not come into NATO. And so Victoria Nuland and the U.S., John McCain, was all of them. They were in Maidan in the protests, handing out cookies. You know, they love street protests. That's why we always see them in Times Square. And, you know, whenever we're, you know, like having a militant protest, you can always count on high State Department officials to come and give us cookies. You know how that works. They were actually in Maidan giving out cookies, but when they weren't in the square giving out cookies, they were figuring out who the next government was going to be in Ukraine, and they were going to make sure Yanukovych, the neutral government, was gone, and that the U.S. would have a puppet regime that would bring Ukraine into NATO, again, making the war nearly inevitable. So let's watch this clip. It's Victoria Nuland talking to the U.S. ambassador at that time in Kiev, at the time that the protests were going on. Listen to what she's saying. She's saying, this is right before the coup, which was February 22nd, 2014. She's saying, we're going to tell you who the government is, who the new government will be. Matter of fact, they're handpicking who the Ukrainian government was. And guess what? A month later, that was the Ukrainian government. Let's watch this.
I think we're in play. The Klitschko piece is obviously the complicated electron here, especially the announcement of him as deputy prime minister. And you've seen some of my notes on the troubles in the marriage right now. So we're trying to get a read really fast on where he is on this stuff. But I think your argument to him, which you'll need to make, I think that's the next phone call we want to set up, is exactly the one you made to Yachts. And I'm glad you sort of put him on the spot on where he fits in this scenario. And I'm very glad he said what he said in response.
Good. So I don't think Klitsch should go into the government. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think it's a good idea.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you think what in terms of him not going into the government, just let him sort of stay out and do his political homework and stuff. I'm just thinking in terms of sort of the process moving ahead, we want to keep the moderate Democrats together. The problem is going to be Tony Book and his guys. And, you know, I'm sure that's part of what Yanukovych is calculating on all of this.
I think Yachts is the guy who's got the economic experience, the governing experience. He's the guy, you know, what he needs is Klitsch and Tony Book on the outside. He needs to be talking to them 4 times a week. You know, I just think Klitsch going in, he's going to be at that level working for Yatsenyuk. It's just not going to work.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Okay, good. Well, do you want us to try to set up a call with him as the next step?
My understanding from that call, but you tell me, was that the big three were going into their own meeting, and that Yachts was going to offer in that context a three-way, you know, the 3+1 conversation or 3+2 with you. Is that not how you understood it?
No, I mean, that's what he proposed, but I think just knowing the dynamic that's been with them where Klitschko has been the top dog, he's going to take a while to show up for whatever meeting they've got. He's probably talking to his guys at this point. So I think you reaching out directly to him helps with the personality management among the three, and it gives you also a chance to move fast on all this stuff and put us behind it before they all sit down and he explains why he doesn't like it.
Okay, good. I'm happy. Why don't you reach out to him and see if he wants to talk before or after?
Okay, will do. Thanks.
Okay, I've now written, one more wrinkle for you, Jeff.
Yeah.
Can't remember if I told you this or if I only told Washington this, that when I talked to Jeff Feltman this morning, he had a new name for the UN guy, Robert Seri. Did I write you that this morning?
Yeah,
okay.
I saw that.
He's now gotten both Seri and Ban Ki-moon to agree that Seri could come in Monday or Tuesday.
Okay.
So that would be great, I think, to help glue this thing and have the UN help glue it. And, you know, fuck the EU.
No, exactly. And I think we've got to.
Sorry you all had to hear her say fuck the EU. But we kept it in because it we bleeped it for our radio show, but it kind of gives you a sense of what's really happening, who's really the dominant power. Cleach is one of the people there. Yats was Yatsenyuk, who became indeed the prime minister a month later. And Tonnybrook was the Nazi. And she wanted to keep him out. She said, they can meet 4 times a week, but we'll keep the Nazi out because it's better to keep the Nazis not like be the prime minister. They could just meet 4 times a week. That's better. But here it is. It's the U.S. I mean, remember again, everybody, and I'm going to end on this. Ukraine was the second biggest republic in the Soviet Union, historically connected to Russia. And now the U.S. is overthrowing a democratically elected government and putting in a new right-wing government that declared war against the Russian-speaking people in the eastern part of the country. Apparently, the U.S. doesn't care about them. 14,000 of them died after this coup in the next 8 years. They did all of that. And then when Russia said, look, this is unacceptable, they said, your demand for negotiations are a non-starter. So when we go forward, and we're going to announce here some other anti-war activities, when we realize that the U.S. government refused to negotiate, it's only because they wanted the war. They want us to be silent about the war. They're threatening people who even have mild slogans like the path to peace with violent and physical assaults and demonization. When we see that the U.S. government is responding like this, that means we're on the right track, because we have to be able to organize the millions of people, tens of millions. Some of them vote Democrat, some of them vote Republican. Most of them don't vote at all because they're so sick and tired of the system and don't believe in it. But we don't care about any of that. If you're a worker, if you're a young person, if you're somebody who is part of the working class and suffering as everyone is suffering right now because of a billionaire-induced economic recession, then we should unite together to fight against the war makers, fight against imperialism, and say that we have more in common with the people in Ukraine and in Russia and everywhere else in the world than we do with the American bosses on Wall Street or in the CIA or the Pentagon. We are building a worldwide movement. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Another big round of applause. Brian very clearly reminded us who our enemies are and where they're at. Pennsylvania Avenue. They're in Langley. They're at the Pentagon. Our enemies are not in Moscow. Our enemies are not in Kyiv. And I would add, our enemies are not in Beijing. They're not in Havana. They're not in Caracas. To bring us a fresh perspective on how this crisis and this war that's been imposed on all of us affects not just the people of Ukraine and Russia, but also affects the global South. We've invited an American journalist, writer, activist, who in his travels around the world has seen directly the plight, the plunder, the bloody hand of US imperialism, whether it's in Ethiopia, whether it's in Haiti. Wherever he goes, Eugene Puryear is often the voice of reason against empire.
Well, I guess we're holding the mic now, so I'm just going to dispense with this. Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very spirited here, so I'm sure you all feel well today, feel good. I'm happy to be here with you. You know, it was mentioned earlier that I came, and my colleague Kay from Breakthrough News was with me from South Carolina. We got up at 4 this morning. We almost didn't make it. We had to run through the Charlotte airport. We might have pushed somebody out of the way. I don't know. We had a lot of apologies, though, many, many apologies. We went to great lengths not to, and I don't say that just for you to say, you know, oh, wow, how sad, but to give you a sense that, you know, for the two of us, and you should have seen us on the way over here in the car, checking our phones, looking at it, trying to watch the thing. Are we going to miss it? Are we going to make it? What's going on with the traffic? Who timed these lights? All these different questions. Because we were desperate. I feel honestly, we were desperate to be here in this room alongside you to say that it's time to take the power back, to say that we're going to save the planet, not to destroy it, that we're going to feed people, not starve them, and that we're going to end wars, not start them. You know, I think it's critically important to reinforce before I get into my other remarks, you know, exactly what Manolo said. I don't know where he went a few speakers ago, but about the importance of people power. Because I think when you look to your right, when you look to your left, when you look later to see how many people watched on the live stream, when you talk to your friends and your family and your coworkers who, when you tell them about it, say they wish they were there, those are the people you can count on in the moments of crisis when the entire media propaganda machine is turned against you. You certainly can't count on any of the politicians. That's 100% sure. Not in America, not in Europe. They all ran in the other direction. When the going gets tough, the politicians start running. Now, if we have 1 million people on the street, the phone at the Answer Coalition will be ringing off the hook from the politicians who want to speak. But when you have to get something started, when you know that everyone is going to say that you're the worst thing that has ever happened, you're a genocide denier, you're a Putin puppet, you're Page, you're this, you're that, the people you can count on are the people of conscience, the working and oppressed people of the world who know what is right and are willing to stand up and be counted, and that is you in this room. And I just want to say something very particular about that because, you know, in the game of U.S. politics, the two sides are always trying to find a way to get one up on the other one, you know, to think, let's see what level of discontent is out here in the populace, and let's see if we can play on that a little bit and we can, you know, maybe get a few votes here and there. Some of us can remember, you know, in the Yugoslavia war, the Republicans, they became very anti-war. They were against wars. So much so that George W. Bush, when he campaigned in the year 2000, said, I'm not a nation builder. We're not going to go abroad and do all these different wars. George W. Bush. What happened next? And what's happening next week when George W. Bush is speaking with Zelensky at the George W. Bush Library? So right now, when the Republicans are saying, oh, we're against Ukraine, please. You know, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she wants to take the money going to Ukraine and send it to the southern border to kill Haitians and Guatemalans. Don't kill the white people, kill the brown people, and we'll all be fine. That's the nature of that two-faced opposition. So you can't rely on either of the major political parties in America, certainly not on the Labour Party or the Tory Party in the UK, not on the so-called socialist in Spain, not on the shameful Green Party of Germany that has turned its back on its history of opposing nuclear war that made it popular in the first place to become the most bloodthirsty warmongers in the European continent. So I'm proud to stand with you here today because I know that I can count on you and that we have each other's back, and we're going to continue to grow and to build this movement. But, you know, when we look at the plight of the world today, I mean, it's amazing when you think about it. You know, we were in South Carolina, we were riding along, going from place to place, and the driver said, well, you know, at least gas prices are going down a little bit. And, you know, it made me reflect, knowing I'd be here in a few days, that, you know, from Sudan to Sri Lanka to Sao Paulo to South Carolina to the South Bronx, working class people and poor people on every corner of the globe are suffering from a massive cost of living crisis. And a cost of living crisis is not solely this war, but it's been so heavily exacerbated by the war, you can't separate it. Obviously, when we're talking about gas prices, Also, when we're talking about hunger, about famine, which has already been mentioned, the hundreds of millions of people. And those numbers, as any humanitarian agency will tell you, are always an undercount. They're always an undercount. We could have 1 billion people going hungry if we really get in the nooks and crannies of every place. You mentioned I was in Ethiopia. You go to some of these back areas there that, they're barely connected to what's going on. But there are people who are there who are starving. They probably aren't being counted. So in every corner of the globe, this is happening. And it was mentioned by Dr. Jill Stein very well that sanctions are playing such a key role in this. You look at what's happening with the agricultural crisis now, and I'm not going to quote all the numbers, but you look at some of these different pieces on fertilizers especially, which is a big piece that people forget. You're talking about right now, the crisis right now, but don't forget the crisis in fertilizers affects the crops next year. So it's not just right now, it's next year, and it could be the year after that. Largest ammonia pipeline is an important part of fertilizers in the world, which runs from Russia through Europe, closed. Urea from Russia, which is a major part of fertilizer, 22% down the year, January to August. So even after the grain deal, we're still seeing it. And some of this can be replaced. And that's what a lot of the people criticizing this event might say. And I'm sure they're watching right now and typing it up so they can criticize me for not knowing what I'm talking about. And they say, oh, well, Brazil, yeah, they used to import a lot of wheat and fertilizer from Russia, but they replaced it from Canada. Well, the reality of this is it's not simply about the issue of the crops themselves. Can I get something from here and bring it over here? It's about the way the markets work. You want to know who's having a good year this year? The Chicago Mercantile Exchange, I'll tell you that, where they're trading all these futures and commodities for all these foods, wheat and the like. Because ultimately these speculators, Wall Street extended, these speculators look at every possible crisis, every bit of volatility, and they jack up the prices. So you can get it if you can afford it. In Somalia, they can't afford it. In Sudan, they can't afford it. In Sri Lanka, they're struggling to afford it, and thankfully for them, Russia is giving them some of it for free and cheaply. So you've got this massive manipulation of the food markets, of the oil markets, which is going to get worse with this crazy scheme for an oil price cap in the start of December that even Citibank says sounds crazy, could introduce drastic chaos into the market. People who live in New York, you know what I'm talking about because you got the email from Con Ed saying your bill is guaranteed to go up 28 to 32% this winter. It's not just in Europe where people are going to be cold because they can't pay. So we have this massive manipulation that's going on all because of the sanctions mainly, but also the war, because they'll say, well, if it turns this way, maybe Russia won't be able to do that. We're going to jack it up another $5. If it turns that way, well, maybe this isn't going to come out of some Ukrainian port. Jack it up another $15. So whatever they can do to make as much money as possible. And don't forget, 54 cents out of every dollar of inflation is going to profits. So they don't have to raise the prices, but they want to because that's how they live, the suffering of others. That's that 1%, that chart. How do they get that 1%? Because everybody else is at the bottom. It's a direct connection. So we can see the impact of this war is so unbelievable on almost every person, really, who's not in that 1%, in almost every part of the world. And it's an amazing scenario because despite that, and despite the fact that we're on the precipice of nuclear war, the International Committee of the Red Cross said that there would be catastrophic humanitarian consequences from even a limited nuclear war, whatever that is. The nuclear bombs they have now, my father, many years ago, he went to Hiroshima not that long after the bombing, and I remember he told me that it stuck with him for the rest of his life because some people had been vaporized so quickly that their shadows were burned onto the wall. And the nuclear weapons they have now are 50 times stronger than that. You drop one of those on a major city. I looked at a map, actually, of what would happen in New York City the other day. Gone. This, gone. Forget it. Nuclear winter. Crops destroyed. Water poisoned. Hundreds, maybe thousands of years before you would even be able to do it. Talk about sowing salt in the soil. This is 1,000,000 times worse than that. But despite the fact that the globe is staring down the barrel of millions being turned into ash, and if you want to know how close it is, look how quickly the U.S. called Zelensky and said, whoa, about the Poland missile. And that tells you something about Zelensky and about the Ukrainian government. I'm going to come, because to be honest with you, they had to have known what had happened. And instead of telling the truth, They went out of their way to try to create the basis by which Article 5 of NATO would be invoked, in which NATO would then go into Ukraine and fight Russia, and then we would be in a nuclear conflict. Deliberately. So despite the fact that the world is on the brink of existential nuclear crisis, catastrophe, world-ending consequences, despite the fact that tens, hundreds of millions of people are struggling to make it, 161 million people here in the United States have at least some trouble meeting their basic expenses week to week. 161 million, that number has grown by 24 million since March. And that's in the richest country of all countries. So imagine people who don't live here and how much they might be struggling. You know, in Sudan right now, they're saying, I saw a headline the other day, that people are scared and hungry because not only can they not afford the things they need now, but they don't know how much worse it's gonna get. But despite that, we are told that we don't have the right to speak. All these internet trolls who came out had so many things to say about this event. It's so easy to talk tough online, isn't it? You know, people posting, if you want to disrupt the event at the People's Forum, here's a video on how to do it. Well, if you want to disrupt, I'm here right now and I'm ready. When do we have the right to speak? Can the people in Congo speak? How come no one is even talking about Congo right now? War going on there. War been going on for multiple decades. Maybe as many as 10 million people died. That never really makes the front page. Never really makes the front page. Can the people who I saw when I was recently in Brazil on the side of the road, no food to eat, no money, no heat, no shelter, when does their voice get heard? When the guy who was driving us around in South Carolina is a retired person just trying to get a little change in his pocket, driving people around, having it all eaten up by gas prices, does he have the right to speak? And who are the people who are lecturing us? They say, well, when are you going to let the Ukrainians speak? Well, I mean, Zelensky is on TV every day. Every organization on earth is breaking every rule. They say, oh, well, you can't speak virtually at the UN General Assembly except Zelensky. Oh, we're going to have a joint meeting of Congress where you can speak virtually. George Bush W. Library, CBS, NBC, all of them, all day. And he's got a beautiful green screen. You've all seen it. He's a great actor. So, you know, they got a whole media setup. So I don't even know what they're talking about, but it's a little bit more pernicious than that, because what do they really mean when they say you're not letting the Ukrainians speak? What they really mean is you're not letting the right Ukrainians speak. Because they don't want you to know that Zelensky banned every opposition political party. All the media was banned and put under one military command, so you can only hear what they want you to hear. So they don't want those Ukrainians to speak. You know, they certainly don't want the trade unions to speak. You know, they banned the right to strike in Ukraine. At the same time, they took down the trade union laws to make it easier to exploit the workers and to sell the land to Europeans. I remember reading an article at the end of last year, and it was talking about this issue of the food crisis and whether or not Ukrainian farmers were going to be able to, you know, harvest their crops and so on and so forth. It was a Reuters article, and the guy that was quoted in the Reuters article was a Dutch farmer who had come in and bought this land in Ukraine because under the past couple regimes, from Poroshenko on, they've been selling off the land. They got rid of the old hangover from the Soviet era of not having that corporate agribusiness. And, you know, you can see the impact of that because some other Ukrainians they don't want to hear speak certainly are the Kananovich brothers, political prisoners who are most well known for standing up against these neoliberal laws like selling the land to the highest bidder, whether it's in the Netherlands or New York or wherever they're coming from, destroying the trade unions, impoverishing the people of Ukraine, and they have been tried as spies for daring to speak up about what's going on in their own country. So they don't want to hear from those Ukrainians either. The only Ukrainians you're allowed to hear from, who are supposed to represent everyone else and get to determine what every country is allowed to do at any given time, whether you eat, whether you die, somehow it has to come from somebody affiliated with this war drive, and that's considered legitimate. So it's not about letting Ukrainians speak. It's not about self-determination. It's about promoting war. And it's about keeping dissenting voices from entering into the conversation. I mean, how many people even know there are Ukrainians against the war? Basically no one. Basically no one. So I think we have reached a really an unbelievable precipice here where we must act. And I think this is an extraordinarily important event. I think we'll all look back on it and think about how important it is. You know, you never really know exactly where you are in the stage of history. But I can say when you do something tough, I mean, many of us can remember when we were standing up for Libya. Everyone said, you're crazy. And now everyone says, what a disaster. When we first stood up for Iraq, they said, well, you're paid by Saddam Hussein. And now they say, what a disaster. So it's always later that everybody comes along and says, yeah, you were right. But in the moments where it was tough to stand up, that is what kicked off the ability of other people who were understandably fearful of the onslaught on your reputation, your job, everything against you if you stand up against the war machine. And it takes other people to stand up and create the space for others to feel that they have strength, that they have power, that definitely they're not crazy, and ultimately that they are not alone. So I just want to end by encouraging you to continue to stand up and continue to raise your voices. Don't be cowed. Don't be lectured by these warmongers. I certainly will not be. I'm not going to be lectured by people who would rather lift up the legacy of Nazi murderers than the legacy of the millions of Ukrainians who bravely fought to defeat the Nazi war machine. And I am absolutely not going to be lectured by the people who beat African students so they could ride their Jim Crow trains all the way into exile in Western Europe. And let's spare a word for the people who want to talk constantly about refugees. Every app I have said you want to donate to refugees. And I'm all for donating for refugees. I hope they're all living as well as they can coming from Ukraine. I'm all for that. But what about the refugees dying by the thousands in the Mediterranean Sea? Because all the people who say we love Ukraine, all these governments in Europe who say we love Ukraine also say do everything possible to kill those Africans. They even say let's pay other countries to torture them. Have you seen what they do to Africans in Libya now? Have you seen what they used to give them jobs, money, and education? Now they're torturing them in dark chambers with electricity and everything else you could think of. So don't be lectured by those people. Don't be cowed by those people. Don't be pushed back by those people. You are right, they are wrong. Peace is our imperative. Peace is our challenge. There's a lot we're going to have to do to continue to push past this. You know, I don't know, this is maybe a shameless plug, but the work we do at Breakthrough News and other, media outlets, we don't just do it randomly. We don't do it because we love to be accused of being a part of international conspiracies to destroy the world. We do it because knowledge is power. A book can be more powerful than a grenade if you use it, right? But people are deliberately starved and denied of the knowledge they need to take the action that can change the world. And we have to do everything we can, 1-to-1, 2-to-2, 5-to-5, at the dinner table, on our independent media, I don't even know, just screaming out in the street, whatever we have to do, because these people have billions of dollars, hundreds of television channels, and they're doing everything possible to confuse people about what's really going on right now. So this is going to be a tough fight, a very difficult one. It's been difficult so far. I mean, anyone in here who's tried to talk about Ukraine with anybody who didn't agree with you, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not like it was easy. You had to sort through about 1,000 different layers of propaganda before you even got to the real issue. But if we do it together, we can win. If we stand side by side, we can win. If we aren't afraid to go where other people say we shouldn't go and talk to people, we can win. But we have to remember that this is really and truly an existential crisis for humanity. And as Dr. Chomsky also put out, he said, I'm sorry if these words sound hyperbolic. That's the thing that they make you think you're crazy. They say, well, how could this be the case? It is the case. And it's only by people standing up and saying it as loud as we possibly can that we can turn it around. But people power has defeated every terrible institution, regime you could ever imagine. Ever imagine. I mean, you think about the odds that people have gone through. Imagine Harriet Tubman running through the swamps with dogs chasing behind her after being up for 24 hours straight, trying to take somebody and get them freedom to slavery. Now, most people said to her, why do you keep going back? Why would you do this? But she never stopped. And when the country caught up with her, she didn't say, okay, cool, I'm gonna go chill. No, she enlisted in the war effort and she led Union troops back into the South to defeat the slave owners in South Carolina. It's always darkest before the dawn, and I'm honored to be able to stand here with you. I'm honored to be able to stand here with these august panelists, and I'm very much looking forward to moving from this event to the next event to the next event until we win and get rid of the threat of nuclear war, get rid of the threat of hunger and famine, get rid of unemployment, get rid of every negative thing that we see out on the streets that drives us crazy. We can do it together, and we'll do it if we're organized and if we're ready to win.
We are on the right side of history. When I say people, you say power. People, power. People, power. People, power. People power is going to end this war. And because people power doesn't stop, this event is not over yet. We have one more speaker who's going to join us. But even when this event ends, people power won't stop. Because we are already planning to be on the streets on January 14th. We are going to lead a march of thousands from right here, the People's Forum. We're going to march to Times Square. And we're going to march across the United States. We're going to join marchers across the world saying no to this imperialist war. We will not sacrifice our brothers and sisters around the world. We are honored. We are excited. We're pumped because some speakers were not able to come because of technical questions. But we have Vijay Prashad here in person. And Usually, if you've heard Vijay Prashad in person or even seen him on screen, there's no way you leave now wanting to move and to act and to build. Vijay, the stage is yours.
Thanks. No war but class war. No war but class war. Only one kind of war is acceptable, class war. Isn't it great to be in the People's Forum? And to the entire staff of the People's Forum, and of course Manolo, we have to thank them. I mean, this is a beachhead in an outrageously wretched, ruling class dominated world. You have to build from here, but you have to first secure this. So always keep in mind the importance of places like the People's Forum. If we didn't have this, we couldn't have this meeting. It's really important that we build institutions, we build infrastructure, we build the place where we stand and say we're not moving. Because it's from where you stand that you can walk. So just remember this place. It's not just a place where you come occasionally. It's the beachhead of our movement. So when you leave this place, make sure to find somebody who works at the People's Forum. And despite the fact that Biden has said that the pandemic is over, maybe give them a hug. Because it is tense to have events like this, particularly when very strange elements say that they're going to come and do violence. or disrupt an event. It creates neurological tension for weeks. So make sure to recognize that they're carrying this for us. No war, but class war. Last night, my daughter Rosa and I went to see the new Black Panther movie. Now, it's an incredible movie. It's one of the best made films I've seen in a long time. 3 hours long. It could have gone on for 6 hours. I mean, it was incredible. And I was really enjoying it, especially the moment when out of the water emerges this great Mayan god who comes out onto the beach and he proposes a historical alliance between the people of Wakanda, the free African Republic, most powerful country in the world, and this undersea Mayan kingdom, which has been able to resist the Colombian depredation of the Americas. They went undersea and developed a great civilization. The two vibranium powers of Wakanda and this great Mayan empire were going to come together. And he said, we'll crush effectively the imperialists. We'll crush them. We'll destroy them. It was so exciting. I couldn't wait for what was going to come next. I thought this is going to be the best film ever. And then the screenwriters lost their nerve. And then the screenwriters just couldn't take it to the next level. Because at that point, you see, the interesting thing is that the CIA character in the film is a hobbit. So, if you have the CIA character being a hobbit, it's really hard to dislike the CIA. And he's the cute hobbit. You remember? And the director of the CIA is Elaine from Seinfeld. I mean, how could you dislike Elaine from Seinfeld? You have a hobbit and you have Elaine as the CIA. And the guy who's the US ambassador to the UN, playing with his glasses, is the nice guy from House of Cards. He's a nice guy. And also he sort of looks like somebody's grandfather. He's kind of clueless in the movie. So suddenly the screenwriters lose their nerve. And in come the Yanks. And the Yanks are really nice people, benevolent. Because US imperialism is benevolent. It's a hobbit, it's Elaine, and it's the grandpa figure. The villain must be the Mayan. So suddenly, this great Mayan king from under the Caribbean Sea comes up with a diabolical plan. He says to the Wakandans, and I don't really care if you haven't seen the film. I am sort of ruining it for you. But let me tell you, it's a really good film. And my synopsis is really quite irrelevant because anyway, I'm so crazy, I probably saw the wrong film. I'm interpreting the film as erroneously as I obviously interpret reality. So the Wakandans, he says, this great Mayan king, the Wakandans, either they have a choice. They have actually George Bush's choice. Either you're with us or you're against us. He says to them, either you fight with us to destroy all the powers, aka the great anti-colonial alliance against imperialism, my great fantasy. I was thinking the movie is going to go again in that direction, despite The Hobbit. despite Elaine, either you make this great anti-colonial alliance against the imperialists, or we'll attack you. Now, it's an unfortunate choice, and I very much doubt that the great Mayan kingdom from under the sea would demand this choice of their Wakandan comrades. I very much doubt this. But nonetheless, that's what the screenwriter had to do, because they had to make the Mayan diabolical. Because the CIA is the Hobbit. And the Mayan has to be diabolical. So, well, obviously you know what happens. You see, the Wakandans, who had lost the Black Panther, as you know, from the first film, the Wakandans could very well at that point have said, well, let's negotiate. Let's have a diplomatic dialogue. Let's have a discussion, a sit down. You know, when Noam Chomsky and I were writing the book, The Withdrawal, at one point in our conversation, he said, United States is like the mafia. He said, it's like they're like the Godfather. And right through our conversation, he kept referring to the US government as the Godfather. If you don't like what the US government says and you don't agree to do what they say, they're going to whack you. The first time Noam said that to me, they're going to whack you, I had to start laughing, because at the time, Noam was, you know, the full Noam with a lot of beard and a lot of hair, little Gandalf the wizard Noam. And when he said, they're going to whack you, I started laughing. But I thought about that a lot. And of course, neither Noam Chomsky nor I have really, maybe he has, he knows everything about everything. But okay, speaking for myself, my entire understanding of the mafia comes from the movies. As you can see, most of my references are from films. So I know The Godfather, the 3 films, which I love a lot. And I, of course, know The Sopranos, which I think, you know, at least the first season was terrific, after which it sort of lost its way. And even in the mafia films, I say to Noam, they negotiate. They have the sit down. You know, people sit down and they talk, and admittedly, some of them bring guns under the table and they wipe out the opposition in the middle of the so-called negotiation. But at least they have the thing called the sit down. So in the film, unlike the US government, which doesn't do the sit down, in fact, as Brian has laid out so well, does the opposite of the sit down, accelerates war. The Wakandans could have asked for a sit down, but in fact they didn't. Instead, they allowed a possibility of negotiations to be displaced and a war to be accelerated. A war which was catastrophic for both the Wakandans and for the Mayans. And meanwhile, the Hobbit and Elaine and Biden are sitting back in the United States smiling. In fact, the Hobbit gets imprisoned, but that's a separate story. But you see how casually imperialist propaganda works. Here we have a film, a beautiful film, with, at one level, a remarkable message about an independent people, a sovereign people on the African continent. An incredible message. The child of Lumumba. What a name to have chosen. It's an incredible story for people around the world. An independent African, not happy with the kingdom part. Not happy with the kingdom part. But, you know, let's just, for our purposes, call it a republic. An independent sovereign republic on the African continent. And then, because you know how difficult it is to be sovereign in the Americas. If you're Cuba, for instance, you get embargoed and you get sabotaged and assassination attempts and so on. If you're Venezuela, you get an entire hybrid war strategy. So the screenwriters knew that in the Americas, the only way to be sovereign is to be underwater. The only way to have a sovereign republic is deep underwater. It's a remarkable film because you have these two sovereign territories, one on the surface on the African continent, one underwater in the Caribbean, could make an alliance. But they can't permit that. You have to have them go to war, and the benevolent imperialists can smile from the sidelines. You see, what the United States will never permit is countries to have sovereignty and to have independence and to provide a dignified life for their people. They'll never permit it. They won't permit it in films. They don't permit it in real life. Now look at it quite simply. This is not a war, really, just about Ukraine. It's not a war merely about Ukraine. I mean, I feel for all people who are in war. I've covered war. I know how ugly it is. I remember the Iraq war. I remember how ugly that war was. I remember the devastation done to Baghdad, the use of depleted uranium in Fallujah. I remember the war in Libya, a country that I've been going back to for years, the destruction of that country by NATO. I remember those wars. I saw those wars. They are ugly. All wars are terribly ugly. This war is terribly ugly. It may not be as ugly as the Iraq war, as Noam said. They are using different kinds of mechanisms, but it's ugly nonetheless. It's ugly. It's noisy. Wars are very noisy. They traumatize children. Wars are dirty. They're dusty. They destroy the landscape. It takes a lot to recover from the war, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. People scarred for generations. In Iraq, it's going to take 50, 60 years for people to start coming to terms with the illegal US war against the Iraqi people. In Vietnam, United States used ghastly chemical weapons. Ghastly chemical weapons. You walk up and down the central region of Vietnam. They can't eat from that soil for generations. Wars are terrible. Wars are ugly. Nobody should be happy about war. That's why we say the only path is negotiations. Got to stop the noise. Got to stop the dust. Got to stop children being traumatized. It's as simple as that. It's not complicated. Got to do everything possible to stop the war. Which war? Which war? Is it only the war in Ukraine? Who remembers? Who remembers? And I say the word remember, even though it's a contemporary phenomena. I say the word remember because this has been going on since the 90s. There is a war that has been going on in the Great Lakes region of Africa since the 1990s. The war against the people in the eastern section of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Now, once again, pressure from Western warrior states pushing Kenya, Uganda to invade eastern DRC, to join the Rwandan illegal rebel force called M23. Where is the concern about that war? Maybe 30 million people have died in the Great Lakes War since the early 1990s. I reported the war in northern Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado. Anybody care about that war? Nobody knows what the flag of Mozambique is like. In Cabo Delgado, people rose up because two energy companies, ExxonMobil and Total, are extracting natural gas off their coastline. They can see the rig, but it's the poorest part of Mozambique. When the people rose up in Cabo Delgado, Mozambique sent its army in, couldn't defeat them. Mozambique asked for help. The French government said, we would like to intervene directly, don't want to do it. Too much bad publicity. So the French government effectively made a deal with Rwanda so that Rwandan troops entered Cabo Delgado. Silence! Silence. Africans die, nobody gives a shit. Silence. Where are those people online who are so upset that we're meeting here today? Where are they when Africans are slaughtered so that copper, coltan, all the various components, metals and minerals that go into your smartphones, into the computers, where are they? Where is the outrage about that? Where is that outrage? Where is that anger? No war. No war but class war. No war. No war but class war. No war anywhere. Not just in Ukraine. And you know, why does this war happen even in Ukraine? Again, it's not just about Ukraine. Over the course of the last 20 years, a process of integration has been taking place. A historical process of integration that has been taking place for the first time since the ancient world. And that's the integration of Europe and Asia, contiguous land mass, historical integration of Eurasia. It took place partly because of the stupidities of US imperialism. Because let's face it, friends, not only is US imperialism stupid, it's also managed by incredibly mediocre people. And one of them is Antony Blinken. One of them is Antony Blinken. Antony Blinken is an extremely mediocre person. They try to build him up as some kind of intellectual of diplomacy because he speaks French. What kind of intelligence is it take? What kind of intelligence does it take to prosecute wars? It's not an intelligent act. The United States prosecuted 3 wars. One against the people of Iraq, illegal. Second against the people of Libya, catastrophic. And third against the people of Iran, absolutely unnecessary. These 3 conflicts meant that Europe no longer had easy access to energy from Libya, Iran, and Iraq, which is why Europe became more dependent on energy from Russia. That was one part of the integration. Secondly, this bizarre political and economic system called capitalism. Bizarre. It allows a few people to take an enormous part of the social wealth and pocket it. And these people, the ones in Wall Street, the City of London, and so on, don't want to invest that money anywhere. They want to keep their trillions of dollars in illicit tax havens or in their own pet projects like buying Twitter. They're not interested in genuine investment. Europe, which used to rely on foreign direct investment coming from the United States and other places, saw after the financial crisis the disappearance of private portfolio capital from places like the United States, from Canada and so on, except mining companies that like to domicile in the City of London, which is effectively a tax haven and secretive. So who came with investment? The Chinese, the Indians, but mainly the Chinese. Large Chinese investments in Europe, integrating Eurasia. That integration of Eurasia, my friends, is not only historical, it is also the actual process of history. Because whatever the US does, it can only either delay that integration or it can damage it, but it can never stop it. It can never stop it. The integration of Eurasia is just going to happen. And the United States has to come to terms with it. But the US government is refusing to come to terms with it. Now, somebody will say to me, oh, you want to sell out Europe to the Chinese and the Russians and so on. No, it's not a decision I'm going to make. This has nothing to do with me. I'm not even giving you my opinion. I haven't actually given you any opinions of mine except about Black Panther. Everything I'm saying to you is the actual process of history. That's what happened. Integration has been taking place. It has scared the US ruling class because it's meant that the European countries, which were tethered by an undersea cable in this Atlantic alliance with the United States and Canada, that Europe started to drift away from the Atlantic Ocean and move towards the Eurasian landmass into its old normal connections, which are ancient and had been blocked by the period of colonialism, blocked by the Cold War, and blocked by the post-Cold War dispensation. That integration has been happening. It is inevitable. It's going to keep happening. United States, terrified by that, says that Russia must be weakened and that China must be weakened as well. If you read the national security strategy of the US government, they openly say all measures must be taken to confront China, which is the leading competitor of the United States. You see, from Obama onward, there was an attempt to just talk tough with China. We're going to get you. We're going to break you. We're going to stop Huawei. We're going to prevent you from doing this, prevent you from doing that. The gangster, the godfather, the mafia. You're not going to listen to us. We're going to whack you. Nancy Pelosi, so brave. She's going to fly into Taiwan. Brave. She's going to fly into Taiwan, guys. Talk trash about Xi Jinping. Justin Trudeau talking trash about Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping comes up to him and says, hey, listen, don't leak things that we talk about in private. Did you watch that clip? Don't behave like that. And then Justin Trudeau. Did you see the way he walked off? It was sort of, because countries like China, and they're not all countries of the left, countries like India, countries like, they don't want to take this shit anymore. They don't want to be lectured at by, mediocrities. Justin Trudeau. Who's Justin Trudeau? Blackface, remember? Racist, blackface. What kind of person is Justin Trudeau? Slinking away, no guts. Biden doesn't know his left from his right. Sleepwalking into nuclear Armageddon. What kind of people are these? Even Narendra Modi, not a perfectly, enough said about Narendra Modi. And I have said a lot about Mr. Modi, and it's got me into a lot of trouble from Mr. Modi. Neo-fascist leader. Even somebody like him has a foreign minister who says, did you hear the foreign minister of India was accused, said, stop buying oil from Russia. And he said, let me just tell you some things. I've been looking into this, he said very calmly. And he said, what India buys from Russia in oil in a month, he said, Europe buys in an afternoon. Think about it. I mean, effectively, the foreign minister of a neo-fascist government in India is telling the United States media, not today, colonizer. Not today, colonizer. This historical integration is just going to happen. You can't stop it. One of the reasons you need to build a massive peace movement, not only in the United States, but in all the Western warrior states, including Canada. One of the reasons to build this massive peace movement is not that you come out in support of those people out there or these people out here. It's because you have to join a global movement. The mood is changing, friends. People are not interested in this anymore. You got a handful of white politicians meeting at the NATO meeting, a handful of white politicians meeting at the NATO meeting talking about global NATO. Nobody's interested in them. Nobody takes these people seriously. They are not respected. What's the name of the guy who runs NATO? Who cares? Who cares? What's the name of the current CIA head? Who cares? You know what? I don't need to know the names of these people. I want to abolish NATO. I want to abolish NATO. I want to abolish NATO. And I want to abolish the CIA. In fact, it's for me, you see, for me, I understand, the need to change the budget and move the $1 trillion and so on. But my provisional demand is abolish the CIA. That's just a start. Abolish the CIA. What has the CIA ever done that's been good? Overthrow the government in Guatemala, overthrow the government in Iran, overthrow the government in Chile, overthrow the government in Honduras, overthrow the government in Bolivia. What has the CIA ever done that's been good? What have they done that's been good? And I'm not sure that it's good for the ruling class. Unless the ruling class likes to see greater and greater instability, and unless the ruling class is actually looking forward to nuclear Armageddon. And they might be. You see, they're crazy enough. If the ruling class can be measured by the intelligence of Elon Musk, if the ruling class can be measured by the intelligence of Elon Musk, God forbid. I'm that old kind of Marxist that likes to believe the capitalist class has a rationality. And it might, as a class, have rationality. But the individual capitalists are idiots. As a class, they might have a great rationality. But as individuals, they're terrifying. No war but class war. No war but class war. No war but class war.
People, people, in the words of the VJ Prashad, we are going to say, not today, colonizers. Not today, warmongers. Not today, ruling elites in Washington who are willing and ready to kill the planet. My friends, this rally, this demonstration is coming to an end. But our movement is being born today. Raise your hand if you're joining me in January. Keep your hand up if we're going to march in March. Keep your hand up if you believe that we are on the right side of history. Every speaker today has reminded us that we are not the crazy ones, especially this time around. Not only are we not the crazy ones, but we're actually the majority. This is where the mass sentiment is. For those who are online and cannot see, but this room is standing room only. Hundreds of people came together today, in person, online, to say no to this proxy war, to say yes to peace. So we're excited for what's to come. Stay in tune, stay connected, stay together. Our movement is only starting. If you still, after everything that we've said today, felt that what you donated earlier wasn't enough, how much does a bus cost for mobilization? $2,100 to bring 50 people to DC. Who's going to help us bring 5,000 people to DC? Those red buckets, bring them out again. If you want to help us end this war, if you want to see yourself in the movement, open that heart, open that wallet. Together, we can do this. We cannot expect none of the warmongers to fundraise this movement for us. We're not taking a cent from the Rockefellers. We're not taking a cent from Soros. We're not taking a cent from anyone in DC. Only we can defeat the war monster. If you're online, you can text Peace Today to 44321. Can we do this? Can we do this? Are we going to win? Are we going to win? Are we going to end this war? Yes. Thank you to all the speakers who've joined. Thank you to each and every one of you. Thanks to the volunteers from the Answer Coalition and from the People's Forum. You're all welcome to hang out here for the rest of the day.
Mm-hmm.